one of the rules of science modern science, when it was first emerging in the 17th century, was that you had to banish anything that had to do with God. Okay, you had to keep God out of it. They were looking for naturalistic explanations for phenomena. So one of the things that they threw out in the bathwater, basically, with God, was teleology, what's called teleology. Now, teleology is the idea of causes running in reverse. We would now call it retrocausation. That's the term that physicists now use.
Causes running in reverse.
In temporal reverse. That is to say, something in the future affecting something in the past. Okay? We usually think of causes going forward in time,
right?
But
effect happening first, cause happening later.
Exactly. Yeah, an effect happening before a cause.
Right.
Okay. So at that time, teleology was just assumed to be like, if you were talking about teleology, you were automatically talking about God's plan, all right? And so teleology got thrown out of science because it was not fair bringing God into the equation. And if you were talking about causes running backwards in time, you were implicitly at that time talking about God's divine plan. All right.
Okay.
So now, so the idea, the presumption that causes only run in one direction, it worked fine in science for a couple centuries. But then almost exactly a century ago, physicists discovered that on the smallest scales in nature, and we're talking about quantum scales, it doesn't quite work. That there's this element that's always been called randomness or indeterminacy or uncertainty, okay? And so quantum physics for the last century has been about this component of causation that cannot be predicted from past events, from prior events. And now you have all these interpretations of quantum, of this mystery. Okay, there's a lot of different interpretations. You got the Copenhagen interpretation. You have the many worlds interpretation. You have like a lot of different sort of competing interpretations of what it means that certain things cannot be predicted from a chain of prior causes. And one of the theories is retrocausation. Well, wait a minute. Maybe causes are propagating from the future to the past, as well as from the past to the future. And maybe that's what accounts for this thing we're calling randomness. Now, one of the most influential figures in early quantum mechanics was Niels Bohr. And he was a very brilliant man and very sort of powerful personality. And he sort of dominated the conversation, like in the early years of quantum physics. Okay. And he sort of convinced people that it's just random, and you have to accept that the world is random on the smallest scales in nature, and we have to just accept it, and there's no reason for it, and that you've probably heard the idea of wave functions collapsing, the collapse of the wave function. This is kind of the core mystery in quantum physics, is like things are they're mostly unpredictable until you make a measurement, and then things take on a solid reality. There's kind of things behave as waves. Double
slit experiment.
Double slit, all that, yeah. And sort of there's this mystery of what happens when you make a measurement of something. Right. And that from that, there's a popular idea that somehow it's observation itself that collapses the wave function. And maybe it has to do with our consciousness or something like that. Right. That's one, it's not a mainstream idea in physics, but that's been taken up by, certainly by people in the New Age and stuff. It's an appealing idea that somehow it's our minds that are causing reality or whatever.
Right.
But anyway, Bohr said, just don't worry about it. Just do the math. The equations can be used to predict very well what happens to particles in the aggregate. Like if you have a bunch of particles, you can tell exactly what's going to happen. Even if you don't know what's going to happen to a single particle because of this indeterminacy factor. But more and more physicists now are talking about retrocausation, that, hey, wait a minute, what if that whole randomness thing, what if it isn't random? What if my measurement now of this particle, this electron, is actually causing what happened in its past? And in that case, is not random. And there's this retrograde component in causation, retrocausation. And they have actually done experiments that suggest that that's what's going on. I'll give you an example. This is from my book Time Loops. I talk about this. But in 2009, there's new methods in quantum physics that are enabling researchers to kind of probe this question.
Okay.
And one of the methods is called weak measurement. I mean, it's kind of complicated how it works, but the idea is, in most measurements, you affect the thing you're measuring, and
Yes.
so it causes problems. But there's this method called weak measurement, which is if you like weakly measure a bunch of particles, you can kind of like measure them without affecting them. Okay. So what they did in this experiment, it's very similar to what happened in Daryl Bem's experiment, except this time we're using photons, not Cornell undergraduates, okay? Just substitute photons for the Cornell undergraduates. Basically what they did was they took a laser beam, all right, and they put it through a beam splitter. So you have the same beam, but then it's split into two, all right? Now then what they did was they weakly measured the photons in both beams, all right? And then they subjected one of the beams to a strong measurement, if you want to put it that way. And what they discovered was that back in time when they were weakly measured, the photons that got the later strong measurement had been amplified significantly. So that later measurement amplified the photons in their past. I see the look on your face, but it's the exact look, on your face when you learned about Daryl Bem's experiments. I mean, you like, what the? But it means that causes that events in the future at time point B somehow affect things at time point A in the past. And the idea, I think the idea of me and others who study precognition are that, okay, so the brain is somehow, well, first of all, a lot of more and more people now think that the brain is some kind of quantum computer or a quantum, sort of a hybrid quantum classical computer, because there seem to be quantum processes going on inside neurons. You've probably heard about microtubules. Well, yes. So microtubules, one theory of consciousness is that they have to do with these little molecular quantum computers inside neurons called microtubules. Uh-huh. Well, I think microtubules are responsible for reshaping the synapses during learning. And I think that microtubules are getting information from their future and reshaping the synapses based on what's going to happen to that cell in the future. I know it's mind-blowing, but evidence for this is actually coming from the field of quantum computing, because one of the things that's being discovered in people who are working with quantum computers and working with models of quantum computers is that you can reverse temporality in a quantum computer circuit. And sort of essentially, my simplistic way of putting it is that you can get an output before an input in a quantum computer circuit. And there's several articles on this phenomenon just in the last few years. So it's looking like quantum computers, might be more than just sophisticated number crunchers. I mean, it looks like, quantum computers might eventually make possible communication across time. This is a possibility that if you saw did you see the television show, The Peripheral? No. It's based on a novel by William Gibson. He wrote The Neuromancer back in the early 80s. He was sort of predicted, cyberspace and everything. Right. Well, his novel, The Peripheral, and they made it into an Amazon series a couple years ago, is about people using a quantum computer server to communicate across time. And
wow.
Yeah. And so, but that if what's being shown in these early days of quantum computing, if it pans out that, oh yeah, this is, this isn't about sort of spatial non-locality. You'll hear that word non-locality a lot. It's about temporal non-locality. And if these threads from quantum computing are true, if these threads of quantum biology hold, that indeed the brain is a quantum computer or involves quantum computation, well, right there you would have a physical explanation for how information from the future could get into the past, and how we could have precognitive dreams, or we could have what exactly happened to you, where it's like, oh, a thought comes into your head about this random person you haven't thought of in ages, and suddenly you get a call from them. What if this is always happening?
Right.
What if this is always happening, and that's kind of a part of like a guidance system, or the analogy I draw in my Dreamwork book is to imagine the usefulness of something like this in like a safety device, and so I imagine my 2030 Tesla, okay, has a quantum airbag, okay, and it deploys a second before a collision, not because it predicts the collision, but because it's got a quantum computer and it knows when there's inevitably going to be a collision, so it deploys my airbag just a second earlier to enhance my survival. Well, what if we're going through life with this quantum airbag that essentially cushions us against like shocks?
That gets pretty philosophical, though, doesn't it? Extremely.
Yeah. I'm hoping we run out of time before we have to talk about free will, because the free will question is so, it hovers over all of this.